Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast, an exploration of the blurry line separating our physical world from our abstract realities. Conversations and stories, myths and reality, science and the gods we worship, the esoteric and the everyday. Come explore with me. Teddy Hamstra, welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Josh.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were just talking about your work with the Joseph Campbell Foundation. And in particular, we were talking about the Mythblast Newsletter, which is how I've come across a lot of interesting people to speak with. But I guess I want to, maybe that's a good place to just kind of continue, because I was curious as you were speaking, maybe you could tell me a little bit more about the Joseph Campbell Foundation in general, maybe some things that I'm not fully aware of, like the kind of things you guys are doing. But also I'm curious about your role there and kind of what the goal is, I guess, for your role or for the foundation in general.
Yeah, I mean, one of the simplest explanations of what we do as a foundation is we are really trying to keep Campbell's legacy alive in the 21st century. That includes keeping almost all of his works in print. So you were talking about the Mass of God book series earlier, Hero with a Thousand Faces, obviously. So we have a really great relationship with a publisher called New World Library. So if you get those books now, you'll see the kind of JCF Ouroboros logo on the spine, and that's us. And another part of kind of keeping what was in print during Campbell's lifetime is we also have there were about 2,000 recorded audio lectures that Campbell left behind when he passed away. And those began sometimes in the mid 1950s when Mass of God and those projects were going, and it went up through the 1980s. I'm sure you've seen the Power of Myth interview series with Bill Moyers, who just passed away, sadly, a few days ago.
Yeah.
And so something else that the foundation has been able to do is take from those recorded lectures, sometimes that, the audio fidelity is not the highest, and create books based on sort of thematic ideas that Campbell was lecturing on. So we've got books about religion called Thou Art That. There's a great book called Myths of Light, which is a lot of his lectures about Buddhism and Kundalini yoga, and the ecstasy of being, which is some of his writings about dance and embodiment. I think, something that just has drawn me to Campbell is his really, I think, underappreciated, creative, and romantic relationship with this woman, Jean Erdman. And they were married for, the remainder of Campbell's life from the 1950s onward. She lived to be a very mythic age of, I think, about 103, 104, somewhere like that. She died in 2020, but she was a really phenomenal choreographer and modern dancer. And so I was, that was just one of those biographical details that as I was starting this PhD project about Joseph Campbell, I thought, well, that's interesting that he not only was married to this choreographer, but they did a lot of collaborative endeavors together. So anyway, Ecstasy of Being is a collection of his dance writings and stuff like that. Another thing we've been doing is sort of remastering and re-releasing the best versions of those audio recordings. So we have those coming out on our website now, in MP3 form. So if people want to listen to Campbell rather than reading, we have that. We were talking about the Mythblast Newsletter. That's where we invite a different contributor every week to provide about, a 1,000-word, maybe that's even too long, kind of snippet of reflections about mythology, trying to incorporate ideas of Campbell's and also other thinkers on mythology, mysticism, comparative religion, all of that sphere of thought. And we do these every quarter we do sort of a free public webinar. And I don't know if you've attended one of those, but they're great. And we usually have our executive director, John Booker, and some of our other staff talking. Joanna Gardner, who works with us, she has a great book called The Practice of Enchantment that came out last year. And that's sort of a collection of her myth blasts over the years. So, we're both, preserving Campbell's legacy, but we're also wanting to expand the conversation, right, of the next generations of mythic thinkers. And because I think one of the great things about Joseph Campbell is that you can take his theories and you can take his ideas at face value or however you interpret them. But I also really think of him as just this kind of really a kind of gate opener. I think of him as sort of someone at a threshold crossing for people getting into spirituality, getting into mythology. And I think he's a great guide that can open these gates really widely for you and just let you explore, I think through Campbell, a lot of people have found Carl Jung and those type of thinkers. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit of what we do at JCF.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like I've had that experience with Joseph Campbell where he's definitely that gate opener for me. And it's interesting because we were talking about before how in the Masks of God, how he has this ability to go into the myth, and obviously you see it as the story and he can point that out, but then he can go kind of like a layer deeper. And it's interesting because the world we live in today, a lot of people are struggling with the idea of religion or the idea of spirituality in general. And it may seem as if somebody who goes in and opens it up or cracks open the myth is going to make it less impactful. But my experience with Joseph Campbell is the opposite, where he's not discounting myths by revealing kind of their underlying wisdom or the secret that's hiding underneath. He's not discounting the myth. He's actually making it more impactful in a way because it really does open you up to seeing the imagery or the symbols all around you. Whether it's, you guys have been doing in the Mythblast Newsletter, you've been doing film this year. And after reading Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, like I can't watch a movie without just inherently seeing the kind of the imagery behind it or the symbolic message that comes behind it. And Joseph Campbell does a great job of taking stories and making sure that we don't literalize them, but that we see kind of the psychological process that's going on behind the story. I think that's fantastic. It's also just really fun for me. I'm like I've always been a deeply introverted person, and I enjoy writing and reading, and I really enjoy the symbology of life. And so it's fascinating to me. I'm curious for you, because obviously working for the JCF, you not only are you're performing. It's like running a foundation, so there's a business side to it and there's a technical side to it. But it seems that everybody who works there is also pretty fascinated by the work itself and curious about all the mythical insights and imagery anyway. So I'm curious, when did all of this kind of stand out to you? When did you find Joseph Campbell, or when did you discover an interest in myth in general?
I will try to keep this as succinct as possible while trying not to elide, we're talking about storytelling. So here's, the story. I heard about him, I want to say when I was a middle schooler. And I've always been a history buff. I've always been someone who, like, growing up, if we rented a movie or something and the DVD or whatever had special features, talking about the movie, like I wanted to know all the things around it in addition to appreciating it. And there was this great History Channel special. You can find it on YouTube now, but it's called something like Star Wars Behind the Myth. And it really was my first introduction, I would say, to what I then did as a kind of life path for over a decade of, literary criticism. It was a great program, very accessible program, talking about, let's kind of break down like the lightsaber is Excalibur, and here's kind of these Zen things that inform Zen and samurai things that inform the Jedi. And it was all this stuff that was like, wow, this movie series that when I was a kid, I would just endlessly rewind those VHSs and watch them, and to see that these symbols, right, referred to things really all across the world, right, from the spiritual traditions of Japan to sort of, it shows how those uh, the scenes of the stormtroopers marching in those kind of grand parades is Lucas drawing on Leni Riefenstahl and that kind of, Third Reich propaganda. And so it's just like, wow, this sense of culture and history built into a story that you can appreciate on its own, but also sort of connects outward to all these things. And in that special, Joseph Campbell got mentioned as the sort of singular influence on George Lucas when he was writing writing the original Star Wars movies, and as he was conceiving like how to tell this heroic journey story. So that's where I first encountered Campbell. That didn't lead me to reading him, but it was kind of lodged in a deep part of me. And when I went to college, I was studying literature, and I was really obsessed with the kind of big, complicated, intimidating modernist, postmodernist writers, James Joyce, Thomas Pynchon, Don DeLillo, the kind of big, beefy novels. And in trying to, dive into those, I was fascinated for, I think it was my first semester in college with James Joyce. I wanted to learn more. I tried to read Ulysses. It felt like opening a book, and it was just fog emerging. I didn't understand what the hell was going on. But I was curious about it. I was curious about, I've heard that this book is sort of Homer's Odyssey retold in one day of a life of a Dubliner in 1904. And so I thought, well, that's an interesting project. And as I got a little deeper into Joyce, a kind of mentor recommended, he's got this crazy book called Finnegan's Wake. It was his last book. It's famously unreadable in the sense that if you ever meet anyone, Josh, who said that they've read Finnegan's Wake, they're lying, because no one's ever really read it. You can kind of accompany through life with it, but it's a strange text. And this mentor said, yeah, this guy Joseph Campbell wrote a skeleton key to Finnegan's Wake, where he tried essentially to translate for the reader what the sort of gobbledygook language of Joyce's prose was referring to. And so it's like this numerical thing, okay, that's actually the prose Eddas of Iceland, and like this is a Incan god motif thing. And so that's the first time I read Campbell. It's not his most exciting work by any measure. It's pretty much for very specialized nerds like me. And so again, that was really, I encountered Campbell in this odd way of like, I knew he influenced Star Wars. And then I encountered him in this literary criticism fashion. And it kind of went dormant, my interest in him. And then I had what is a kind of, I guess it was a kind of mystical experience. It was my first year of my PhD program here in Los Angeles, and I was pursuing a project really kind of that evolved from what I did in college, about looking at how kind of contemporary American authors in fiction were trying to use the visual arts as ways to approach that question of spirituality and spiritual experience, but not right, that what does it mean to be spiritual but not religious? I think that phrase is so common in our day. And so I was diving into that, and those questions were rolling around, and I was going to campus one morning. It was pretty early, and I just, who knows what in the air of LA County got in my eye. And there was something really lodged sort of under my contacts, and it was driving me crazy. And I was totally red-eyed in one eye. And I went into like a Walgreens, CVS, something to just get eye drops to just give me some relief before I had to go to like a 3-hour literature seminar. And behind the sort of above the cash register as I was checking out, there was this Baby Yoda plush toy. And that fall was when the Mandalorian TV show had debuted on Disney Plus. And, you know, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but I'm sure you're aware of the Baby Yoda.
Yeah. I at least I want to say they made multiple seasons, but we for sure watched the first season with our kids. Yeah, we really enjoyed it.
Yeah, like it's a great kids Star Wars show for sure. Long way of saying that I had this split second weird memory thing that got lodged up of looking at this Baby Yoda plush doll and thinking, oh wait, that the reason that that's there in some mysterious way is related to this guy, Joseph Campbell, who started his career writing about Finnegan's Wake. So how do we get from Finnegan's Wake to Baby Yoda? Like going from one of the most avant-garde, unreadable art for art's sake things ever produced, right, to Baby Yoda, which is like the multi-trillion-dollar franchise that Disney had just bought. And so that was the kind of animating question of like, I need to learn more about this Joseph Campbell guy, because that's an unusual chain of influence. Not a lot of people who had the type of life and career that Campbell did can, you can look at where the influence went. Carl Jung influenced a lot of people, but his trajectory, right, of who's come in the wake of him is a little different. And so I was drawn to that initially, as just a question of like, what is this guy all about, and how do we get to Baby Yoda from all this intense mythic scholarship?
Yeah, that's a fascinating this mystical experience that you had, because when I think about it, this is information that you were actually holding on to for a long time. Like you came across Joseph Campbell and Star Wars when you were young, and then you had tried to read Finnegan's Wake, which I've also tried to read Finnegan's Wake. I've reread the first maybe 2 or 3 chapters several times, and just it's like this nonstop stream. It's almost like a stream of consciousness, as if you're literally just inside somebody else's head. And to be inside my own head is enough to try to keep up with all the random connections. So, but you were aware of this information for quite a while, and then for whatever reason, in this moment, this Baby Yoda, strikes this thought for you, or kind of brings this synthesis of knowledge together and creates this spark of curiosity. It's interesting though, because of the almost mythical significance of your eye being in some kind of distress, where you're probably covering one eye, and very Odin-like, the sacrifice of one eye so that you can actually see. It's pretty interesting. Did you have something?
No, I was just thinking about, there's something with Oedipus too, right? And blindness, if I'm remembering correctly.
That was his punishment. Yeah. I'm actually reading Alice Miller's book, Thou Shalt Not Be Aware, which is it's pretty interesting. It's a dive into that. And she talks about the punishment of blindness for kind of discovering things, but it's I'm curious then, because you ended up, this must have affected you because you ended up doing a dissertation geared towards Joseph Campbell then. So this is something that I'm actually pretty interested in, is to just, if you're willing to talk about your dissertation, you just finished up. Like, again, congratulations at the University
Thank
of
you.
Southern California. But your dissertation is titled "Enchantment as a Form of Cure: Joseph Campbell and the Power of Mysticism." And so I kind of want to go through each of these, even just right there in the title, kind of these different ideas. And hopefully you're not too fatigued by talking about this or researching this, because I'm sure you've spent a lot of time on it. But mysticism in general, maybe that's an interesting place to start. What is mysticism, and or at least how do you think about it, and how has it been a part of the human experience?
Well, I would say that it's been part of the human experience for as long as we've been interested in sort of looking beyond what we need to eat, where we're going to have shelter, and looking at the stars. I think that Campbell would also say sort of is, mysticism is sort of birthed in the cave paintings for him. That was the idea of ceremonies, shamans, cave paintings, all of that. I will say that to answer part of that question about mysticism, that mystical thing with the Yoda, that was in the fall of 2019, and then the spring of 2020, obviously the world shuts down. And I will say that selfishly, this project really kind of reeled me in a way that I kind of felt like when you're thinking and writing about contemporary America so much, that what I was doing in my work, the spring and summer and fall of 2020, the now of America was very much, you couldn't get away from it. And it's not to say that I just sort of tuned out from those things. There was a lot of very, difficult, I think, conversations, both mentally and interpersonally, that we all went through, in terms of, if you want to talk about like the national myth of this country, that's a whole separate sort of podcast series you could do. But
those are the kind of things I think about all the time, though.
Yeah.
Like, we don't have to get sidetracked, but yeah, it is an interesting idea.
But, so I think, again, selfishly, I got a copy of, I should say, like, I got the set from a used bookstore seller that I had a relationship with, of The Mass of God. And that kind of became my way to travel in this time when I was really cooped up and stuck, and seeing, and it wasn't just it wasn't just escapism. It was really seeing, oh yeah, there are people around the world across millennia who have been asking these very foundational questions about the human experience, about what it means to be alive and alone and in partnership, and all of these things, from shamans, the Tungus shamans of Siberia, to the amazing and kind of probably terrifying sacrificial rites of the ancient Aztecs, to someone like James Joyce in Paris in the 20s. And so I think the way that Campbell was sort of walking me through world history in a way, but with a mystical bent of being interested in, not just kind of the evolution of cultures, right, but of the kind of the more mystical underpinnings. And yeah, I don't know how to sort of drop this as an aside without also getting a sidetrack, but when I was in college studying literature and art history, I was also on track to become a Catholic priest. I was trying to enter the seminary in Denver after I graduated at CU Boulder. So I had that sense of a kind of vocation, and anyway, so Campbell, that didn't happen. But the way that Campbell was looking at kind of the origins of early Christianity, right, and the whether that was in the Gnostic Gospels, and the kind of way that the myths of Sumeria and in Persia were filtering in and influencing what became, the Jesus myth, the Jesus story, all that stuff was really mind-blowing to me. A concise definition that I like to think of mysticism is really that it's an experience that ideally actually takes us beyond language. So in some ways that's not a helpful definition, but it's an experience really beyond the kind of strictures that language puts on our experience. And it's a way that boundaries dissolve. And Campbell and a lot of other thinkers, whether that's in the Zen tradition, whether that's Christian mysticism or, the Ogallala Sioux visionary shaman writer, Black Elk, that Campbell returned to time and again, talks about, they talk about I-thou relationships dissolving, where you can really see the other in yourself. That's a mystical experience. It's a feeling of being at one, being in harmony with yourself, with the other, and really with the kind of cosmic order. And I think that Campbell's definition of, basically saying we're not searching for the meaning of life, but we're, looking for an experience of the rapture of being alive. The rapture of being alive is what the mystics are trying to communicate, right? It's an intense feeling. It's often a very embodied feeling. You usually don't have a mystical experience just sort of sitting on your couch. Sometimes you do, but you look at the stories of saints in many different religious traditions, or of healers, shamans. These are people going through what might seem like a sort of schizophrenic episode, or a trance state, or a hallucination, right? A really intense experience. And in terms of artists, I think you're talking about stream of consciousness writing, the kind of flow state that you get into in a creative project, I think is also very mystical, where the words just sort of flow through you, or when you see musicians just locked in, and jamming, whether that's far out skronking, late John Coltrane, spiritual jazz stuff, or intense like black metal of just digging into these chord progressions. Like that's all kind of that sense of really getting to that oneness, even if you don't realize it at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And music is a great example of, I don't know, the artist kind of embodying that mystic state, because they're doing it in time. It's not a static observable object. It's similar to dance. It's a process through time, just like living life. It's this amazing thing. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there that's really interesting to me. So I was going to ask you if you had a religious background, because I always find that pretty interesting. I too have a very strong religious background, but so maybe we can circle back around to that. But this idea of the mystics and their ability to experience life by dissolving boundaries, by separating the subject from the object, and just realizing that you come to it. I think they do it a lot better in the Eastern philosophies because of the practice of meditation and yoga, and the emphasis on dissolving the ego, or ridding yourself of desire, and so you kind of just become this experience of life. But in the West, yeah, it really seems like in the West, what we've needed is we, especially given our Judeo-Christian culture, we seem to turn every mystic that sticks around, we turn them into something like a prophet. And my view on prophecy or vision or whatever is similar to what you were explaining. It's almost like an artistic experience, or almost akin to a schizophrenic experience, where the boundary between, say, the waking world and the dream world becomes so blurry that they start to experience everything as if it were a dream. And there's this really interesting idea between the difference between, say, a genius and a crazy person, and people always talk about how thin that line is. And I think that at least in my interpretation, the genius is simply the one who can kind of integrate those things that they've seen back into real life, so that it doesn't, the dissolving of boundaries doesn't seem to perpetuate a haunting. Instead, they can kind of pull it together and then bring that information back to the group, back to the tribe, or whatever it may be. And it seems like in the past, in ancient past, the people were much more willing to accept those who kind of walked that boundary. And over time, things get literalized and things get formalized, and everything becomes much more black and white, much more absolute. But in the past, it seems like we really have valued those people, and probably going forward, we're going to need a lot of those people as well to help us figure out kind of the next phase, the next, as the snake continues to eat its tail, we're going to need a new kind of emergence of a new myth moving forward, and we'll need those people to help us get there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of the, there's a lot to respond to there, but I've been thinking lately a lot about one of Campbell's famous phrases, which is, along the lines of, the mythology of 2000 BC is not sufficient for that of 2000 AD. And he was really, he was quite, he was very stern when it came to a literalist interpretation of myth and of religion. And I think for him, he was definitely quite disappointed, to put it mildly, to see the way that that the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, in a very literal way, were kind of trying to make these old stories work in ways that they don't speak to us in the way that they should. And it's not to say that he was dismissive of, the insights that those could bring, right? I think he really felt that whether it's in Sufism, in the Islamic tradition, Kabbalah in the Jewish, or sort of, the mystical path of people like, Julian of Norwich and Meister Eckhart and, Thomas Merton, that the mystic underpinnings of the Abrahamic religion sort of pointed the way out of the dilemmas that they continue to create. But, I think one of the important insights I've learned in thinking about mythology a lot is that it's not a neutral phenomena. Sometimes I like to give a kind of provocative presentation about, Campbell's four functions of mythology, and we talk about a common story, and there's a way that that exists, right? Really from like the level of interpersonal friendship or relationship, or just even, I'm sure that you've by now had people write to you about your podcast and say something along the lines of, I think about these things too. Like I've sometimes felt alone, but I know that I'm not alone, right? That feeling of not feeling alone is, that's a common story, right? Your podcast is creating a common story. And so I like in presentations sometimes to put this provocative juxtaposition of, a photograph. I think it's a great photograph taken sort of from the audience, from the stands of one of these arenas of the Taylor Swift, Eras tour. And it's, you can see all of these young women, primarily with the sort of Taylor Swift bracelet thing that was a big part of that. And it sort of is mirroring her on stage wearing those. And it's like, that is a common story, right? She has been unfurling a kind of mythology in her music, and that people have been very resonant with. And then to juxtapose that, that's a common story that, in the grand scheme of things, pretty harmless, I would say. Maybe some people would object to Taylor Swift, but I would say, it's pretty harmless, in terms of what it's doing. And then you could sort of, cut and paste any photograph of like a mass rally dictatorship, kind of red square, the Nazis, North Korea, whatever, on the other side of that. As those are common stories as well. Those are mythologies. They're powerful mythologies. We have really powerful mythologies at work in our world today. So it's understanding that they're not neutral, and that I think the mystic path is a way of getting us towards what my dissertation is about, of care, of how do we care for one another? What is the path of love, as opposed to these kind of mythologies that are about control and domination, right? And power. And so that's I think the split, right? Is that I think the tension of someone like Pope Francis, is that he was somewhat of a mystic in the sort of most literal and confining chair of the papacy. And I think that's just always that's a fascinating navigation that he had to do, of, how do you maintain the orthodoxy of Catholic myth, and also point people to the kind of Franciscan mystical core that I think he actually, on a personal level, I don't want to speak for him, but I'm sure he cared more about than like canon law, for example. So anyway, I know that was kind of a lot of disparate things.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It seems so the Taylor Swift example, juxtaposing that to Hitler on stage in front of the National Soviets, or National Socialists. I have this sense that almost all religion, at some point, if you go far enough back, it probably started more in form similar to an art.
Yeah.
A representation of somebody's experience in their given time and place. And the way that you're talking about connection, if somebody can come along and speak their experience in such a way that it connects with a lot of other people, it seems to kind of become these movements. And then these movements, I think they're really important. It's one thing that strikes me about myth is that oftentimes people think that the word myth just means a lie or something that's not true. And so if you start to discover the myths that you're living, it may seem as if you should reject myths. I'll just reject myths and then live in reality. But I don't think that our brains work that way. In fact, I think that we don't have the ability to step outside of some version of living a story. And so it's more about finding the myths that are helpful, finding the myths that help move you forward, the myths that make sense for you to participate in. And it seems like all of human history has just been artists letting their inner self speak about their experience in a way where enough people will look around and go, yeah, that's my experience as well. Or yeah, I can relate to that. And then that movement, takes us forward the next step towards, whatever the next reality that emerges out of that is going to be. And Joseph Campbell really helped me see how it's like this constant process of evolutionary in a way, where the story keeps evolving and the psyche keeps responding to the story. And so the psyche evolves and then the story evolves and it keeps moving forward in that way. I think it's fascinating. And then, the next part of you were talking about care and how we care for people, and I would like to dive into that more. The way that you spoke about it as the modern form of care almost being like an authoritarian system or a control system. That's what I've seen a lot in my own personal life, coming from the religious background that I come from. It seems like there's a mentality of the older generation caring for the younger generation by ensuring that they keep the rules and they do what they're told and they're obedient. And in a system like that, it's really easy to see people as either good or bad, as either doing what's right or doing what's wrong. And when people do what's wrong, there's like a strong judgment that comes down on them. And oftentimes, especially in a religious setting, there's a casting out or an excommunication of sorts. And it seems like a flawed way, obviously a flawed way of caring for people, when if you can step back and see them as a human being, then you recognize them what they're experiencing is just the same thing that everybody has always experienced. It's a psyche in their time and place struggling with the context of that. Yeah, but I'm curious, since again, this is your dissertation, and I would love to hear you just dive more into that idea of care and what you mean by it, and kind of what you came up with in your work.
The common thing that people know if they know Joseph Campbell, right, is that hero's journey idea. And it both is a part of his work, truly. I mean, it is foundational for him. But, as part of that, it really is a kind of, you could think of it as a steps of initiation, if we want to make it a little more esoteric sounding.
I love esoteric stuff, so I love the word initiation. Yeah.
But because again, in this sort of literary criticism world I was in, Campbell in like the 1950s through 70s was quite in vogue for people in the academic literary world to apply the monomyth hero's journey idea to like whatever fiction, play, poetry that a given literary critic was interested in. And that came to be really derided. And there's a generation of literary theorists that were like, well, he's just saying all stories are the same story, and that's not true, and blah, 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 bad, banished, excommunicated. And so as I was doing this dissertation, right, I was like, I'm not trying to say we should go back and sort of turn him into sort of a new, like we don't need to recuperate every single part of his theories. Some of them are, you could just say they are wrong, in the sense that some of the stuff in the massive God, or I don't know if you've seen his the really amazing, lavishly huge books. They're called Historical Atlas of World Mythology. He was working from anthropological or archaeological sources that, maybe now you could say are outdated or have been disproven, etc. So the project isn't to say like, let's reliteralize Campbell. But I felt like, well, there must be something more to this guy's thought than just saying it's about heroes going on a journey, and how that is a great template for the Hunger Games and Harry Potter up until this day. There's got to be something more than that. And what I discovered in having an animating question of what do we actually mean by, oh, I'm spiritual but not religious. That's something that I hear a lot in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is a very spiritually friendly place, I would say. But if you say you're religious, there's this kind of instant shudder. So I wanted to sort of try to understand, like, what is it? What are these seekers? I'm a seeker, but like, what are we after? And are we just trying to sort of have our cake and eat it too, right? Of like, are we back in my sort of former life? There's that term cafeteria Catholics of like, oh, I like the, Saint Teresa Lisieux thing. I don't like the abortion thing. And like, I'm going to sort of pick the parts of Catholicism that work for me. There are some people who would say, yeah, that's human. That's how life works. And that's great. And there are other people who would say that's heretical, what have you. Um, so I wondered, is this just a modern kind of phenomena of we just want to kind of have the parts that we like. We don't want the things of religion that are kind of creepy and have rules and are, is it just that? And what I discovered is there was this conversation happening that Campbell's a part of, that's continuing today about enchantment, this word of enchantment or re-enchantment. And it's about kind of, it's about mystical experience. Often the people theorizing it are not saying that because they're coming from a more academic lens. But it's that, again, heightened, intense, sensory, embodied experience of really profound noticing of kind of the world around you, and seeing it as, as transformed in a way, as a kind of as boundaryless, and that can have a transformative effect on you. And I found that Campbell was talking about the mythology, what it instills in us is an experience of enchantment. Another synonym for that would be wonder or awe. A feeling of tremendous gratitude, of ecstasy, of beauty, of something that's outside of yourself that also illuminates the interior parts of yourself. And so I saw that he was talking about enchantment. I mean, he uses that word a lot. There's an amazing, in that book I mentioned earlier, Myths of Light, where he's breaking down Om meditation. What I loved about it was he's talking about, right, the really ancient yogic teachings of meditation from the East, but he's lecturing to a group of New Yorkers in the 1970s, and in this passage he talks about, you will notice the sound of the icebox in your apartment. You hear the sounds of the street below you, and it will enchant you. And to me, that's right. You're talking about we need new mythologies. Campbell was also saying, there has to be a new global mythology for this world we're living in. And he didn't have an idea of what that was because he didn't live to see it, and he knew it would take time. But part of the enchantment, right, is to really dare to find something meditative and transformative in the things that are not beautiful. He lectured a lot at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur. I don't know if you've ever been up to Big Sur, California.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's an easy place to have a mystical experience. Big Sur is enchanting. The hard work, right, is for me, if you're kind of driving back to Los Angeles through Central California, through very industrial agricultural parts of the state that are not necessarily beautiful in the way that Big Sur is, can you find the enchantment there? I'm a yoga practitioner, and I often go back to the idea that, yoga is not what I do in the studio when I'm sweating in the middle of a kind of pretzel-shaped position with my body. The true yoga is being on the 405 in rush hour, right? Can you get to a place where you're not just cussing in your mind at all these other people around you in these weird mechanical devices, that are stop starting and hurtling down this freeway? Like, that's where we have to find enchantment.
Yeah. I love in the Buddha story or the Buddha myth, they have that phrase, everything is a Buddha thing. And I think that's it's saying that it's a quick way of summarizing the same thing that you're saying, is that in every moment could be meditative. Every experience could be meditative. You can take notice of your surroundings and your inner feelings at any time. And yeah, I like that a lot. No, keep going. This is good.
And so that idea of enchantment, I discovered for him was that was enchantment, the way that mythology, storytelling, the creative experience is a source of wonder that again, it's also about fighting cynicism. Follow your bliss is one of his most famous catchphrases, right? And I think there's a way that I even have to fight my own, I have to do some unlearning um, about encountering a phrase like that and thinking, well, that's naive. That's a little ridiculous, right? Or like in everything there's a Buddha. I don't know. That doesn't, there's a real cynicism to the modern age that's partly from a kind of, the work of disenchantment, which is a whole, vast, complicated world historical thing, right? That you could say it began in the Industrial Revolution. Some people are like, it's actually Martin Luther, and there's a million answers to that question. It's really fascinating to look at. But I would say the easiest way to think about disenchantment is that it's it's the boundaries, right? It's the borders being up between ourselves and the world we live in, between ourselves and others. And when you do that, I think you lose the capacity to see. Um, I think you lose a capacity for joy. Um, there's a kind of skittishness that I notice around a lot of people, and this is myself included. I'm not trying to say that I am a perfect sage all the time, but that these teachings, right, of if you really boil down all the teachings of people from the Buddha to Meister Eckhart to whoever, a lot of it is like it's about love. It's about love one another. That's like love is the key. All you need is love, right? You can hear that song, and there's a little bit of a part of you that goes, is that right? Is it that simple? Um, and I think that's really the challenge of someone like Joseph Campbell is to say, yes, it's not simplistic, but you can experience the rapture of being alive. That's what he would say 100%. Um, and so it's part of the sense of care is that we have to be willing to risk joy, risk love. Love is a risk, in whatever form that takes. And that's to me what my dissertation was looking at is I was interested in him as an author. I was fascinated by the way that he wrote these sort of scholarly books that even within them, I think part of what you've resonated with the Mass of God is the fact that Campbell started, I don't know if you know this, but when he was a teenager and in his 20s, he was trying to do creative writing. He was writing short fiction. And he gave that up at a kind of young age, but I think it never really left. And so what my dissertation wanted to look at was the way that voice of the storyteller, of that kind of creative storytelling voice, it filters in his work in a way that I find distinct from other writers about the same topics. So there's sort of Campbell, the creative writer that I was looking at, and then there's Campbell, the orator, right? The Campbell that really spoke to people directly. And he had an unusual career in that he taught for over 40 years at Sarah Lawrence College, outside of New York City. And when he started there, it was in the early years of Sarah Lawrence when it was an all-women's college. And one of the things was about, he was in their English department loosely, but he was teaching everything from like Moby Dick to the Bhagavad Gita, to Sufist poems to, Navajo mythology. And one of the things that kept coming up was Campbell had been schooled early on in a very, academic framework of mythology loosely. And he found that he was having a lot of difficulty with his students who wanted to know, well, what does the myth actually mean for me today? Um, and you know, those young women, their counterparts studying mythology at Columbia, say in the 1950s and 60s, they were getting this really, I don't know if you've ever read someone like Claude Lévi-Strauss, this very French structuralist anthropological approach to myth, which, it takes a lot of untangling to get some interesting prose out of someone like that. Because he's more like, well, see here, this tribe in Brazil, it has this mythic image, and then if you go up the river, there's a sort of linguistic variation, and it's a very kind of mathy approach to how mythology works. And his Sarah Lawrence students were like, we don't really care about that, but like, how does the Epic of Gilgamesh, like, what does this have to say to me? Because on the surface, it seems like this from a completely different world. What does it have to say to me today? And anyway, his part of his teaching, Campbell, the teacher, was a lot of one-on-one conferences that he had with these young women. And I think that informed the way that he developed his voice as a lecturer at places like Big Sur and across the country. That it was a storyteller. It was also a kind of caring teacher, guide. And ultimately the place that I reached in my kind of conclusion to that dissertation is that there's Campbell, the author, in all these different modes, but really what I'm interested in is the moment where Campbell, the mystic, breaks through. And he was quite suspicious himself of, he kind of shied away from anyone saying that he was a guru, or that he was himself kind of, to him, he said that yoga was underlining sentences. That's when they asked him, do you practice yoga? That's what he said. So he shied away from it, but I don't think that means that he's not a mystic. And I think that his writings, they have these different sort of layers and flavors of, the scholar, the teacher, the speaker, but sort of under all that, and then I think that does break through, is him really as a kind of one of our great modern mystics.
Yeah, I agree. I think that his voice in his writing is very he's a great storyteller, and the prose, or it's even poetic at times. And
Yeah.
you can tell that he's wanting to give it to you in a way where you can absorb it. Again, not just on the face value, but the way that it's presented, it's going to elicit some kind of an emotion. It's going to speak to a deeper, more unconscious part of yourself. And in that way, it's very mystical.
And maybe in going back to a point you're making about the psyche and this kind of deep human need and response to mythic symbols, right? That's something that really fascinates me, because it's talking about the non-neutrality of myth. When true kind of colonization, imperialism has happened, of cultures interacting that have never interacted before, that's a great example of how myth is not neutral. Often it's a kind of, if we think about the sort of European experience of, going around the world and colonizing places and seeing the myths that these other cultures had, it was of revulsion, right? It was of kind of, this is heresy, whatever, but it's never a neutral response, right? There was no Portuguese landing in Japan in the 1500s and thinking, those Buddha things, those shrines, there was a real charged response to it. And so I'm curious about what it is in the psyche that can allow us to have such a charged reaction. I would find it very surprising if someone went to a place, particularly a kind of shrine or temple of a culture that they're not a part of, or is very different from their upbringing, and to have a totally to have no reaction whatsoever. I would find that really hard, because I think that symbols do awaken something deep in the psyche, and that's a kind of mystery. I mean, I think of mythology too as an invitation to mystery. That there's not necessarily to me, like a to explain a myth is really not the point.
Yeah.
It's just to kind of further deepen the mystery.
Yeah. And that mystical experience is kind of the coming down of the boundaries, right? The absolutes. So they come down, and then rather than thinking through the myth intellectually, you actually have a sense of a feeling of actually experiencing it. And I'm curious about that as well, like why the psyche can't hold myth in a neutral state. Um, you talk about it in a really kinetic way, where it's almost like you're going out and there's this conflict between the two myths, and the psyche can't handle the conflict. But I often think about it even in terms of, for example, watching a movie. My wife loves to talk about how, because I go on and on about this stuff. I get very, I nerd out about it as well. And so she likes to talk about how she just likes to watch a movie because it's entertaining, because it's fun. And so it's like there's this this simple, almost like neutral response to the actual myth itself. It's just more about the portrayal of it, the storytelling quality of it. But I have this sense that that's only what's happening on the conscious level. But every time we encounter a story, at some unconscious level, it's affecting us in ways that we may not even be aware of. And yeah, I think even watching a movie, there is no movie that you can be completely neutral about. There's no book you can read and be completely neutral about it, because at some level, the psyche is responding to it.
And to go back to what you're saying about just art and creativity in general, the last volume of the Mass of God that Campbell published was called Creative Mythology. And he was very insistent that artists were the myth makers of the modern age. And I've spent years trying to understand what that means. And I still don't know if I fully get it, but I think that's part of the point. And the way that the place I've reached recently is that there's something mysterious and yet communicative about art that can speak again to the psyche across these massive gulfs of borders, of boundaries, of whether it's whether you like just need the subtitles at the bottom of a foreign language movie to get you to see it, but I do think that the fact that you can experience a sense of that you can have a sense of that what something is that's not known to your life experience. I mean, I think that's what art does really better than anything else. I could maybe put like cooking and cuisine as another one of those, as a sort of sensory thing that you could bring people from, Norway and Pakistan together over a meal, and there would be some common story there of culinary storytelling. But yeah, I think that for an artist to be a myth maker, I certainly don't think it's a bad place to start with creativity, because there's something about the images and symbols that artists are engaged in that are that unlock something beyond themselves, and that's the kind of, to me, that's why art, it just, I don't know, it's kind of endlessly fascinating to me, because you can know that it comes so much from the maker's own experience, and yet it's a way to also, kind of psychically time travel into other people's experience. And that to me is a form of care, right? It again might sound somewhat naive to think, oh, well, listening to the music and sort of great stories of another culture is a way of, is that the first step to world peace? I don't know, but I don't think it's a bad place to start. I think trying to understand the kind of myths of another people is much better than trying to understand their politics. I think as a place to begin.
Yeah, agreed. The just trying to understand the experience that other people are having and how they're trying to express it. I agree. Yeah, Teddy, this conversation has been a lot of fun. We've already gone well over an hour and 5 minutes. So I want to give you back the rest of your day. But again, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Fascinating stuff. I think I could talk to you for hours about it all. If people want to find anything that you're doing personally or through the Joseph Campbell Foundation, how could they find you online or website, social media?
They could find me online at jcf.org, and then on our team page it has me, and you'll see that has links to my Mythblast writings for them are on there. In terms of you could hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm on there, Teddy Hamstra. Instagram is all lowercase TEDDYHAMSTRAGRAM, Teddy Hamstragram. And that's just sort of a lot of my brain doodles of putting paintings and quotes and song snippets together and seeing what sticks at the wall. So yeah. Thanks so much for having me, Josh. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. You're welcome. And hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely.